Hello and welcome to Safe Church Group Training. My name is Ben Bork and I am the Diocesan Personnel and Safe Church Officer within the Diocese of Fredericton. Thanks for joining us. The purpose of this video is to act as a full group training session and contains the same information you would hear if I was there presenting or if you take the training online. And if you fill out the attendance sheet, which should be making its way around, you'll receive your Safe Church certificate within a few weeks. So, what is Safe Church? Safe Church is a set of regulations that has been designed to promote the mission of the church by providing a safe and effective working, learning, and spiritual environment. It has been designed specifically to prevent misconduct, especially towards children, youth, and vulnerable adults, and to prevent other types of risk, to protect all members of the church, including the clergy, lay leaders, volunteers, and the congregants, and to complement pre-established regulations concerning discipline. So who does this apply to? It applies to the Diocese of Fredericton, the Cathedral Corporation, each parish corporation, and diocesan camps, as well as their employees, committees, and groups. And this also affects other groups using church facilities and participating in church-sponsored events. And moving forward in the training, I'll just refer to that entire group as the appropriate corporation or camp, as it comes up a lot. Before we dig in, the Bishop has prepared a message on the importance of Safe Church, so let's listen to that.
Hello, I'm here to encourage us all to be participants in the new policy around Safe Church. I have to say, as a former parish priest, I would have found it extremely beneficial to have had such a comprehensive thing in my hand when I was in the parish. This is very important for us as a diocese to be able to be a group of people who are seen to be not necessarily leading the way, but pointing the way into a new future. We have to be seen to be a group of people who are intentional about our need to ensure that members of our congregations, whether they be vulnerable adults or children or any other people, are safe and protected. So I encourage us all to take this particular initiative up with gusto in order to be able to see our church move forward in this important area of safety.
Let's go over some important definitions. First of all, a volunteer. This is a layperson involved in a program with children, youth, or vulnerable adults, but is not a leader. A leader is a layperson or cleric who has leadership authority for the delivery of an activity, event, or program directed to children, youth, or vulnerable adults. A cleric is a bishop, priest, transitional or vocational deacon licensed by the diocese. A church worker is a cleric, lay member, employee, leader, or volunteer of any diocesan corporation or camp in relation to an activity, event, or program sponsored by the church. A child is a person who is 13 years of age or younger. A youth is a person who is between 14 and 18 years of age inclusive. A vulnerable adult, now this comes up a lot in Safe Church training, and it refers to a person who is 19 years or older and because of age, disability, or other circumstances is in a position of dependence on others, or is at greater risk of being harmed by a person in a position of authority or trust relative to him or her. So hopefully those are clear, as I'll be using those terms a lot in this session. So let's talk about risk management. The entire Safe Church regulation hinges on a corporation or camp's ability to manage risk by addressing the following standards: program safety standards, human resource standards, facility standards, and transportation standards. We'll go into more details on those later, but first of all, let's just start with the basics. So what is risk? Risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, would have a positive or negative impact on participants or on the ministry itself. Inherently, risk can be seen as something to avoid, but there are many examples of positive risk, including reduced cost of the program, satisfied participants, deeper spirituality, long-lasting friendships between participants, or the development of new disciples. Now, if a program hasn't been incredibly successful in the past and has continued to be run the same way time and time again, you may not see examples of these without taking risks. Now on to negative risk. These are things that unfortunately tend to come to mind when we think of risk, and they could lead to a real and unsafe practice or outcome for anybody involved in the program. But the key here is that compliance with Safe Church regulation always offsets the possibility of negative risk events. I often get calls at the office with people asking, where do I start? They volunteered for the position of Safe Church officer for their parish, or they're looking to run a program at their church, and they're overwhelmed with the scope of the Safe Church regulation. And that's completely understandable. But there are a few great starting points, the first being to complete a risk assessment. A risk assessment is used to identify, rate, and measure the applicable risk factors for each sponsored activity or program, and to mitigate the negative risk events and promote positive risk events. The easiest way to complete a risk assessment is to follow the Risk Management Guide under the Safe Church tab on the Diocese of Fredericton's website. In the context of protecting children, youth, and vulnerable adults, ministries are inherently rated low risk or high risk. A low-risk ministry would be one that wouldn't permit an adult to be alone with a child, youth, or vulnerable adult, or wouldn't require any significant degree of trust. Some examples of this could be a flower arranger or a greeter or a lay reader. High-risk ministries have a reasonable expectation for someone to be alone with a child, youth, or vulnerable adult. They may also involve people in a position of authority or trust. Some examples would be a cleric, a camp leader, or a warden. All residential or off-site activities are always rated high risk. Once a risk assessment has been completed, you must establish responses to mitigate or avoid the risk altogether. Obviously, higher risks would be higher priority and potentially require a larger response. You can then review with the appropriate authority the real or perceived risks, the risk assessment, and the action plan. Following that review, the event checklist can be completed. There are two versions of the event checklist, general and off-site, and they can both be found under the Safe Church tab on the diocesan website. The event checklist is completed by the event leader and lists the preparations needed to ensure that a particular event complies with Safe Church regulation. It offers a comprehensive summary of Safe Church regulation compliance, so you have a guideline. Now, before we move away from the risk management overview, let's hear from Michael Clark, a warden at Douglas and Nashwauk Sis, on how Safe Church can be seen as smart church.
My name is Michael Clark. I am the warden, and I'm also a lay reader with the parish of Douglas and Nashwauk Sis, St. John's Anglican Church. The benefits of these risk management standards are that not only does it protect the youth and the vulnerable adults within the parish, but it also protects the staff and volunteers. This makes for a better work environment for those who are employed by the parish as well as those who are volunteering. I made the mistake of saying smart church instead of safe church. That is kind of stuck within our vestry because the two really go hand in hand. By being a smart church, you're also being a safe church. I'm also involved with the Scouts Canada program within our church, and these rules have been in place with Scouts for a number of years, and it is the relief on the parents when they see the work that goes into who's going to be dealing with their children, making sure that no one is alone, and all the other rules for transportation and planning that goes into all of this really sets them at ease. This applies also to your Sunday schools and any other events going on at your church. A safe church movement is really going to help with the planning of all of the church events. Everyone's following the same set of standards, so you know it's going to take a little extra time for your planning, but in the end, it's something everyone's going to be accustomed to. For all in-church activities and off-site activities, when it comes to traveling and the number of adult to youth ratio or adult to potentially vulnerable adult ratio, those rules are already in place, so everybody knows who has to attend, who needs to be there for each different type of event, and everybody is comfortable with those standards. On the scouting side of things, I've found that it definitely makes things much more comfortable for me as a leader as well as the parents, knowing that none of the leaders will be alone with the children. There are set safety standards when it comes to transporting children. The same rules apply to the church setting. Everybody will be comfortable and safe, and everyone has a full understanding of the rules, so we know when we are planning these events that all of these standards are covered. From my experience, these standards are very simple to implement. They are not hard to understand, and they really are common sense. That is where the safe church, smart church kind of slip of the tongue really just fits. There's nothing new that is being implemented that isn't being implemented everywhere else.
So now that we hopefully have a solid understanding of what Safe Church is and why we're adopting it, let's focus in on the policies and standards that will allow us to mitigate negative risk and ensure a safe environment for everyone. The shortest policy, but an extremely important one, is the police record check policy. This tends to be a hot button issue when it comes to volunteering, but it's really standard across the board when you look at charities or nonprofits. To be clear, each cleric, employee, leader, and volunteer is to provide a police record check at the commencement of any church work described as a position of trust, or if the position places the individual into contact with children, youth, or vulnerable adults. Going back to our risk categories, the examples of low-risk ministries, like a greeter or a flower arranger, would not require a police record check. However, everyone in a position of trust, if you're signing checks, counting offerings, if you have keys or access, or if you provide counseling, or authority, a leadership, if you're in a mentoring or supervisory role, or in a position to be alone with one of those groups, you do need a police record check. You can find the police record check application under the Safe Church tab on the diocesan website, and you must specify if you will come into contact with children, youth, or vulnerable adults, as that will require the vulnerable sector check. Police record checks are then to be renewed at least every third year thereafter, and the appropriate corporation or camp may reimburse the cost of the record check if there is one. And this is important that no person found guilty in a judicial proceeding of physical or sexual assault is permitted to work with children, youth, or vulnerable adults in church programs. So at the beginning of this video, I mentioned the standards that must be addressed in order to mitigate risk. These all play a part in ensuring a safe environment for everyone. Again, I stress that this is to protect everyone involved, from the leaders to the volunteers to the participants. So let's start with the program safety standards. Ideally, each corporation or camp should prepare a list of the categories of programs, such as programs with preschoolers, after-school programs, baptism and confirmation programs and classes, programs delivered jointly with a non-church organization, specialized programs such as a day away program for adults with special needs. And within this list, job descriptions should be established for each leader and volunteer, and a periodic review of the list should be incorporated. Continuing on under program safety standards, the access to classroom standard states that unless it's an emergency, no one should enter a classroom or other activity location without the permission from the leader. The 2 adult standard states that a minimum of 2 adults be present during all programs, activities, and any provided transportation, and for them to be unrelated if it's practical. Also, a minimum of 1 leader and 1 adult of the opposite sex for overnight and off-site activities, and any counseling of a child must be done in a room with an open door or in an open room with a minimum of 2 adults present, including the leader and parent or guardian if possible. Again, this is for the protection of the adults as well, especially from the potential for false accusations. The corporation or camp must adhere to at least the minimum requirement for the adult to participant minimum ratio standard. In this context, the leader may be one of the adults required to satisfy the minimum ratio requirements. For an on-site daytime event, infants 0 to 24 months must have 2 adults to each 6. Children 2 to 4 years must have 2 adults to each 10. Children 5 to 13 years must have 2 adults to each 15. Youth 14 to 19 years must have 2 adults to each 15. And vulnerable adults must have 2 adults to each 10. For an off-site daytime event, children under 4 years must have 2 adults to each 10. Children 5 to 8 years must have 2 adults to each 12. Children 9 to 13 years must have 2 adults to each 15. Youth 14 to 18 must have 2 adults to each 15. And vulnerable adults must have 2 adults to each 10. For an overnight event, children under 4 years are not permitted, and the rest of the categories require 2 adults to each 10 participants. Each participant in an off-site or overnight event must complete the program waiver and medical release form, which can be found under the Safe Church tab on the diocesan website. The leader of an overnight event and the cleric or parish warden must retain a copy of the program itinerary and all program waiver and medical release forms signed by the participants, including complete billeting information if applicable. Also, if an off-site or overnight event includes the use of a pool, hot tub, or natural body of water, a qualified lifeguard must be in attendance throughout the event. No adult should be alone with a single child, youth, or vulnerable adult at an off-site or overnight event. This is very important for everyone's protection. Also, each facility used must adhere to the Safe Church Facility Standard and be equipped with all the safety features and functions required by the New Brunswick Fire Protection Regulation of the New Brunswick Fire Prevention Act. Each participant must be made aware of all the fire exits and fire evacuation procedures of the particular facility. At least one adult must have access to an operative communication device, i.e. a cell phone. The leader of the program must maintain contact information for parents, guardians, and caregivers in a secure place. Each leader and volunteer must be clearly and appropriately identified whenever working with children, youth, or vulnerable adults. And moving on to first aid. Leaders must be provided with standard first aid and CPR training, and at least one person amongst the leaders and participants on each church or camp program or activity must have their current first aid qualification. A well-stocked first aid kit must be available and accessible during all programs or activities. When it comes to insurance, each church building and facility must have adequate property and liability insurance coverage in place, and that coverage must comply with the Diocesan Minimum Insurance Standard, which can be found under the Safe Church tab on the diocesan website. Moving on to the health and wellness standards, each diocesan entity must promote good health and wellness, including measures that would reduce infection for all participants in sponsored activities. Using the program waiver and medical release form that can be found under the Safe Church tab on the diocesan website, each participant must disclose whether he or she has an allergy or medical intolerance, a dietary restriction, or other medical condition. If there is food at the program, the menu content must be clearly communicated to the child, youth, or vulnerable adult and their parent or caregiver when necessary. If a person is reasonably suspected to have a notifiable disease, that must be reported immediately to the Provincial Health Authority. If they are reasonably suspected to be suffering any of those conditions, they are not permitted to participate in the sponsored event or program. The Accident and Medical Incident Report is a commonly used report, so the following is critical. The program leader must report the accident or medical incident to the parent or caregiver within 2 hours, if practical. The program leader must then verbally report the incident to the appropriate corporation or camp within 12 hours. Following that, the program leader must submit a completed accident or medical incident report form to the appropriate corporation or camp within 24 hours. This will then be forwarded to the insurance company. So that concludes the program safety standards. I know there are a ton of rules, numbers, and timelines to remember from that section, but the important thing to note is that all of this documentation is contained within the Safe Church tab on the diocesan website. No one's expected to remember and recite all this off by heart, but you need to be made aware of the standards and where to find all the supporting documentation, which is the Safe Church tab on the diocesan website. If you require paper copies, just give me a call at the Synod office and I'll send them to you. So let's continue on to human resource standards. This section is broken down into 3 separate standards: the staffing standard for employment and volunteer positions, training standard for initial and refresher Safe Church training, and the performance review standard for assessing employees and lay leaders. Starting with the staffing standard. This is intended to guide and further an individual's call to Christian service by screening candidates for employment and volunteer positions. This can be just as helpful for the person volunteering or interviewing as trying to fit into an unsuitable position for that individual can quickly lead to burnout or just an uncomfortable situation for everyone. All corporations or camps must prepare a list of all applicable ministry position descriptions for staff and volunteer, using the forms for ministry position descriptions found on the website. Ministry position examples include Sunday school teacher, youth program leader, program leaders for adults with developmental or physical challenges, a counselor or tutor, the parish nurse ministry, parish administrator, the sexton, or there's many more possibilities. There should be at least 2 people on a staffing team for the staffing of new employees, lay leaders, and volunteers. The bishop, dean, cleric, or designate, or camp director will always be a member of this team. As far as advertising and evaluation standards, advertisements are guided by the relevant job profile document. Evaluation of applications will be done by the staffing team, who will then create a list of candidates to interview. Each applicant will complete the application form, which is available on the website. This is not required if the advertisement generates cover letters and resumes in lieu of a formal application form. However, applicants must provide at least 3 references and submit the application to the appropriate corporation or camp. The staffing team then interviews and assesses each potential candidate. Reference checks are conducted for the preferred candidate using the personal reference check form available on the website. The successful candidate will then be required to undergo a police record check. In the event of a cleric transferring in from another diocese, the bishop must ensure that the cleric provides a letter of good standing from the bishop of the originating diocese, a police record check, and at least 2 personal references. Each cleric, lay leader, employee, and volunteer is to be provided with access to a copy of the Safe Church Regulation, whether that's online or a paper copy. Safe Church training is to be provided on an annual basis to capture new employees. It is also available 24/7 online, which simplifies things. Upon successful completion of training, each participant shall receive a diocesan training certificate. Refresher training on Safe Church Regulation is required at least once every 3 years. Again, this can be done online. Performance reviews are to be conducted annually for each employee, lay leader, and volunteer. The diocesan staff performance review form, available online, or a similar format should recognize accomplishments and the individual's impact on a program or ministry, provide a structured environment that allows the individual and supervisor to communicate openly about job performance, expectations, etc., allow for joint development of a plan to improve performance, and identify future objectives and goals. Continuing on, we now come to facility standards. Each facility should undergo an initial examination and periodic audit thereafter to ensure compliance with the risk management area of Safe Church Regulation. The diocesan facilities checklist, found online, is to be completed for each church facility. The appropriate corporation or camp must adopt the minimum safety standards and practices. I'll cover most of these, but the full document is, say it with me, available online. Facilities must be equipped with all safety features and functions required by the New Brunswick Fire Protection Regulation and the National Fire Code. Whenever there's a conflict between the New Brunswick Fire Protection Regulations, the New Brunswick Fire Prevention Act, the National Fire Code, and the minimum safety standards, the higher standard will apply. Each facility must include working smoke detectors in designated areas, fire and emergency exits equipped with functioning inside release crash bar on the doors if practical, a fire and evacuation plan in every room which indicates emergency exits, emergency muster areas, wall-mounted alarms, public telephones, fire extinguishers, which have been charged and inspected annually by a qualified technician. Orientation and training on fire and emergency evacuation plans is to be provided for all leaders of the organization and community groups approved to use the facility. Each program and community group that uses the diocesan facility must practice an emergency evacuation drill once every year as applicable. Also, if applicable, a list must be prepared of individuals who may require assistance in the event of an emergency. That list would then be maintained in a secure place on the facility. In the event of an emergency, the leader must immediately escort all able-bodied people safely to the designated emergency muster area, seek assistance, and call 911. If an individual is unable to evacuate due to an injury or incident, the leader must assign a responsible adult to remain with that person. Immediately call 911 and seek assistance from a qualified first aid provider if necessary. An injured person is not to be left alone until qualified assistance has arrived, unless personal safety is seriously at risk. For example, if a fire is overtaking the building and it's likely that you and the injured person you're waiting with are seriously in danger, it would be important for you to get out and inform the firefighters as to the position of the injured person. Now, when it comes to washroom standards, each facility should have a functioning washroom unless prohibited by size or age of the building and access to services. If the available washroom facilities do not meet the standard, if they're out of order, not accessible, during a church-sponsored event, the leader must take immediate corrective action, which may include terminating the event. A leader must inform parents or caregivers to take their children to the washroom prior to each class, service, or activity. But if the children still need to go, and when you gotta go, 2 adults must escort each child or group of children to the washroom. That's for preschool to grade 2. If 2 adults are not available, a trained youth or parent or caregiver must assist with washroom duties. If a single child is using the washroom, the outside door must be propped open while the adults remain outside. If the child requires assistance, an adult may enter the stall only when a second adult or trained youth is within visual contact. For people with disabilities, accommodations must be provided, including a ramp to the entrance of the building if the difference in height is greater than 2 inches, and an elevator, chairlift, or similar equipment to safely move an individual from one floor to another if required. An enlarged washroom stall sufficient to accommodate an individual with a wheelchair is required, along with handrails fixed securely near each toilet and sink. Another important facility standard is openness and visibility. A church program or activity must be delivered by means of either an open door or an unobstructed interior window. Delivery of a church program must be accessible and visible to any person, including another leader, volunteer, parents, guardian, or caregiver. And you'd find this anywhere. If you were a parent or caregiver and had to go down to the furthest corner of the basement and knock on a closed door to pick up your child, it certainly wouldn't feel comfortable or inspire confidence that safety is a priority. Now on to a question I receive regularly. Do other groups need to comply with Safe Church when they use our facility? The short answer is yes, but they only need to comply with the minimum standards to the extent necessary. They must complete the agreement to use a diocesan facility, found online, and provide written confirmation of insurance that satisfies the diocesan minimum insurance standards. However, not every Safe Church standard will apply to every group. For example, if there's a wedding reception taking place in the church hall, the 2 adult standard wouldn't apply. And the last section of the facility standards applies to building and structure standards. Each church facility must be in compliance with the National Building Code, Canadian Electrical Code, and all other provincial and municipal legislation. Also, a non-church facility may not be used for church activity or event if there is any serious visible defect to the building or structure. One of the more recently amended standards is the transportation standard. It states that in order for someone to be considered a qualified driver for a church program or activity, they must have a valid driver's license and automobile insurance coverage. They must be screened in accordance with the Safe Church regulations, should have the training, police record check, etc., and either the driver or accompanying leaders should have first aid training. As far as the vehicle is concerned, this is the part that was recently amended to include a need for the vehicle to be roadworthy and prepared for weather conditions. They have snow tires installed, for example. Again, these things are just good sense, but we have to make it official. Also, the number of people cannot exceed the number of seat belts, and infant, toddler, and child seats must be used in accordance with governmental requirements. Okay, we've now gone through all the standards under risk management and can move on to the privacy policy. Let's start with a few basic principles of the privacy policy. An individual retains ownership of their personal information and has access to it at all times to ensure accuracy and completeness. Collection of information adheres to permission-based principles, which I'll go over soon. A diocesan corporation or camp may collect personal information for the purposes specified before or during the collection. Personal information collected is for the use of the relevant diocesan corporation or camp only, and all personal information held must be accurate and up to date. So let's look into the permission-based rights to privacy. This policy follows the guidelines set forth by the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, or PIPEDA. It includes direction on identifying purposes for collection and obtaining consent, limiting collection, use, and retention, and disclosure, ensuring accuracy, openness, and individual access, and finally safeguards and provision of recourse. Personal information is only to be collected for specific purposes identified before or during the collection. It's also limited to what is necessary for those identified purposes. If the information is to be used for a different purpose in the future, the individual must provide consent. Records are to be retained as an active record only as long as necessary. Personal information that is no longer active is reviewed for retention, selection, or destruction as part of regular records processing. Archival information is accessible in accordance with the Diocesan Archives Records Access Requirement, which can be found online. Information can only be disclosed in accordance with the purpose for which it has been collected. Access to personal information must be restricted to certain people, and that list can be found within the privacy policy, which is Appendix 2, and that's found online. Individuals will have access to their own personal information files to ensure accuracy and completeness. When it comes to privacy online, each appropriate corporation or camp must adhere to the web privacy statement found online. There is a commitment to protect personal information as per the privacy policy. Cookies, or background coding that in this case is used to monitor traffic to the website, are used to track information, but the process does not involve extraction of private information. Are there any exceptions to the permission-based rights to privacy? Yes. Access may be refused when protected by solicitor-client privilege, reasonably expected to threaten life or security of another individual, if it would reveal confidential commercial information, if the information was generated during the course of a formal dispute resolution process. Also, personal information may be collected and used without permission if it's clearly in the individual's interests and consent is not available in a timely way. Collection is required to investigate a breach of agreement in federal or provincial law, if the information is publicly available, for an emergency that threatens an individual's life, health, or security, for journalistic, artistic, or literary purposes with respect to activities by an individual at an open church event or within public domain, for statistical or scholarly study or research, provided that anonymity is preserved. It's very important to note that absolutely no photograph of a child should be taken, stored, or published by a leader or volunteer of a church program without the explicit consent of the child's caregiver, and that consent form can be found online. Personal information may be disclosed without consent to a lawyer representing the diocesan corporation or camp, to comply with summons, warrant, or order made by the court or other judicial body, to collect a debt the individual owes the diocesan corporation or camp, or to a lawfully authorized government authority. Moving on to the administration of the privacy policy, Diocesan Council appoints a diocesan privacy officer, who is currently me. The privacy officer makes an annual report to Council, including statistical data on the number of inquiries and complaints under the policy, along with recommendations on policy changes if there are any. Diocesan Council completes an audit of the privacy policy at least once every 3 years. So a person may complain to the diocesan privacy officer if they believe their personal information was collected without consent, they believe their personal information is incorrect or inaccurate, they believe the corporation or camp has disclosed their personal information to an unauthorized person, or the corporation or camp has refused or failed to disclose information to them following a request. Following the receipt of a complaint, the diocesan privacy officer investigates the complaint and makes a decision within 30 days. A party may appeal the privacy officer's decision to the bishop, and the bishop then has 60 days to make a decision on the appeal. To resolve a complaint, the diocesan privacy officer may dismiss the complaint in whole or in part, order some or all of the information collected without consent be destroyed, order that any incorrect information be corrected in a timely manner, order that information be disclosed to complainant in whole or part, or order return of information that was incorrectly disclosed to third party. So that concludes the privacy policy as we move on to the final section, the misconduct policy. Let's hear from Brent Ham, Archdeacon of Moncton, and his thoughts on the importance of the misconduct policy.
Greetings. My name is Archdeacon Brent Ham, and I'm part of the Human Resource Committee, member, parish priest in Riverview. Also a coach, and I'm involved in a local daycare board. I've had my hand in helping to shape this Safe Church policy, and it's really important to our diocese and can do a lot of good work. I really want to encourage parishes and leaders in parishes to take this seriously. Why do we need the Safe Church policy? It helps us as parishes to create programs that are safe, that are smart, that are healthy, that encourage people to be a part of them and to grow. Some people may think it's just a lot of legislation and regulations, but it's not. I want to give you a little story. Just a few weeks ago, I was coaching baseball, and an opportunity, a parent called me up and asked if I would drive their son to baseball. Sometimes with really good intentions, we sometimes make very risky choices. And I thought, sure, I'll take the son to baseball. And then I thought about it after. I thought, well, what happened if there was an accusation that was made? What would happen if I got into a car accident? What would happen? I mean, there's a lot of responsibility that I was taking on my shoulders. Perhaps there was a better decision I could have made in that moment. And it really got me thinking. Too many times in our churches, we make choices that, even though they're made with really good intentions, might put us in a really risky position. So I think the Safe Church helps us to reflect, helps us to think, and it helps us to make better decisions. So as parishes and lay leaders, I encourage you to use this resource. I know a lot of time and energy has gone into helping to shape it. We've tried to make it as easy as possible to read it and to make some changes in the way we do ministry. And in the end, I just really encourage you to make the best use of this resource, and hopefully it'll help our churches to grow and to change and to make wise decisions. As a church, we want to be smart, we want to be safe, and we want to be healthy as we continue to do mission for Jesus Christ.
So this is an extremely large and at times difficult policy to tackle. So let's start with some of the fundamental principles that were kept in mind when the misconduct policy was created. It was made for the creation of a safe environment for clergy and lay people, the protection, safety, and well-being for complainants, respondents, and others affected, serious consideration and quick investigation of every complaint, provision of pastoral care to all affected by allegations of misconduct, respect for confidentiality, burden of proof and presumption of innocence until proven otherwise, right to access legal counsel or other representation for both parties, non-interference with criminal, civil, or administrative investigation, and the immediate reporting of incidents of sexual assault against children, youth, or vulnerable adults to the New Brunswick Minister of Social Development. The administrative structure of the misconduct policy is set up as follows. The Diocesan Misconduct Complaints Officer filters complaints down to the Diocesan Misconduct Committee, which then opens up to the pool of investigators and mediators. The Diocesan Misconduct Complaints Officer is appointed by and reports to Diocesan Council. Their term is decided by the bishop, and they are responsible for general administration and specific functions as assigned. They may be aided by an assistant Diocesan Misconduct Complaints Officer. The Diocesan Misconduct Committee is also appointed by Diocesan Council, with a term decided by the bishop. It should consist of 2 clergy and 2 lay members. The chair is designated by council with a recommendation from the bishop. They are responsible for investigating all major complaints. A pool of investigators and mediators may be engaged in any misconduct case. They are appointed by Diocesan Council triennially upon the advice of the Chancellor. Their appointment must address experience, training, and regional representation. Each pool consists of at least 3 people. So what is the definition of misconduct? Misconduct means unacceptable behavior, abuse, or maltreatment, and includes any discriminatory practices described in the Canadian Human Rights Act or the New Brunswick Human Rights Act. There are several different types of misconduct, and they are physical, sexual, harassment, exploitation, bullying, emotional, and economic. So let's break down each type of misconduct. Physical assault occurs when one person applies or threatens to apply force to another person. It's intentional and it's without consent. It also may or may not result in actual physical harm. Sexual assault occurs when the assault violates the integrity of the person who is assaulted. As with physical assault, it occurs when one person applies force or threatens to apply force to another person. It is also intentional and without consent. The deciding factors in sexual assault versus physical assault are the part of the body touched or threatened to be touched, the situation in which it occurred, the words and gestures of the person alleged to have committed the assault, and the words and gestures of the person alleged to have been assaulted. Now, aggravated physical or sexual assault occurs if the person is wounded, maimed, disfigured, or their life is in danger. Consent must always be non-coercive. If consent is obtained under threat, fraud, or influence of authority, it is deemed to be no consent. An accused may show honest belief of consent and may not be convicted. However, no consent is valid under these circumstances. For children under the age of 14, or youth aged 14 to 18 if the accused was in a position of authority over them. Moving on to harassment. This can apply to unwelcome comments, unacceptable behavior, or other conduct which is reasonably known to be offensive, demeaning, humiliating, derogatory, or otherwise disrespectful of another person. It may be sexual or non-sexual in nature. Sexual harassment applies if there's any coercion or attempt to coerce an unwilling person into a sexual relationship. It can also apply if a person is subjected to persistent, unwanted sexual attention, used to punish a refusal to comply or to reward compliance. Sexual harassment can consist of verbal innuendo, subtle suggestions, overt demands, unwanted and inappropriate physical contacts of a sexual nature. It can be one incident or a series of incidents. It can also include actions that contribute to a poisoned atmosphere, i.e. suggestive pictures or cartoons or other offensive acts. Sexual harassment is an exploitation of a power relationship. It is not exclusively a sexual issue. Speaking of that, exploitation consists of sexual interference or invitation by a person in a position of trust or authority towards either a young person, under 19, a person in a position of dependency, or a person with a mental or physical disability. Now on to bullying. This involves repeated incidents of negative behaviors by one person towards another person or people, so as to cause physical, sexual, economic, social, emotional, or psychological harm. It also includes cyberbullying. Emotional misconduct is an abuse of authority wherein one person behaves unacceptably and diminishes another's identity, personal dignity, or self-worth. Economic misconduct is a breach of a position of trust wherein one person takes control of or materially affects another's economic resources without prior consent. Now that we've run through the many types of misconduct, what's the procedure? Well, first of all, just some general information. A child must proceed through a legal guardian or other legal representative. A youth or vulnerable adult, at the discretion of the Diocesan Misconduct Complaints Officer, may proceed alone or through legal guardian or legal representative. The Misconduct Complaints Officer may refer a matter under the policy to the Misconduct Committee, even if no major complaint has been filed. The diocesan corporation or camp may assist the complainant and respondent to meet the requirements of this policy. Also, the complainant may withdraw their complaint at any time. If a third party honestly believes a violation to have occurred, they may bring the matter to the leader or the Diocesan Misconduct Complaints Officer. A third party may also encourage potential complainant to make a major complaint. There are two kinds of complaints under the policy, minor and major. A minor complaint is submitted orally or in writing to the leader. A major complaint must be submitted in writing to the leader and the Diocesan Misconduct Complaints Officer. A minor complaint appears to be an isolated incident, does not allege assault, is made by a person other than a child, youth, or vulnerable adult, and may be informally resolved by the leader. A major complaint can refer to, but is not limited to, repeated incidents, alleged assault, or a complaint made by a child, youth, or vulnerable adult, and it may not be resolved by a leader. If the complainant is a child, under 13, a youth, 14 to 18, or a vulnerable adult, the Diocesan Misconduct Complaints Officer must be contacted within 24 hours of a minor or major complaint being made. Alleged incident of sexual assault or sexual harassment of a child, youth, or vulnerable adult is immediately referred to the Minister of Social Development under the New Brunswick Family Services Act and to the responsible policing authority. So how do you make a minor complaint? It can be submitted orally or in writing to the leader within 12 months after the alleged event. The leader may investigate and resolve if the complainant is a non-vulnerable adult. If the complainant is a child, youth, or vulnerable adult, the complaint is referred to the Diocesan Misconduct Complaints Officer, who may settle the complaint or request the leader to do so. After settling a minor complaint, a report is submitted to the Territorial Archdeacon or the Diocesan Misconduct Complaints Officer within 21 days. Unresolved minor complaints are investigated as a major complaint. Now, how do you make a major complaint? First of all, the Diocesan Misconduct Complaint Form must be completed and submitted to the leader and the misconduct complaints officer. That written complaint must be received by the misconduct complaints officer within 12 months after the alleged misconduct event took place. However, the misconduct committee at its discretion may extend the time limit. The diocesan misconduct complaints officer immediately refers the complaint to the misconduct committee and informs the territorial archdeacon and appropriate corporation or camp. Within 5 days, the misconduct complaints officer notifies the respondent that a written complaint has been received. The misconduct complaints officer then advises the complainant and respondent of their right to legal counsel and provides a copy of the formal written complaint to respondent and to the leader of the activity in which the complaint arose. The misconduct committee then commences their investigation immediately, but must suspend their investigation upon the commencement of proceedings under the New Brunswick Family Services Act or criminal proceedings. Throughout the complaint procedure, the misconduct complaints officer tracks each complaint using the complaint procedure form. At any time in a proceeding, the parties to a complaint may engage in mediation, except when the alleged misconduct is an incident of sexual assault or abuse of a child, youth, or vulnerable adult. If a complaint is against either the misconduct complaints officer, the bishop, the metropolitan, or the primate, the next position determines the complaint. If the complaint is against the bishop or misconduct complaints officer, it is submitted directly to the chair of the misconduct committee. There are some special circumstances that can arise during complaint proceedings. For example, if a cleric who hears a confession from any party in a misconduct proceeding, that cleric must disclose the fact to the bishop and cannot participate in the proceedings. Also, if the complaint is made against a member of the misconduct committee, that member cannot participate in the proceedings. During the investigation, the misconduct complaints officer can make a recommendation to the bishop that the license of a cleric who is the respondent in a major complaint be suspended. The bishop must then make a decision on that recommendation within 10 days. Along those same lines, the misconduct complaints officer can make a recommendation to the corporation or camp that it suspend a lay employee or a volunteer who is a respondent in a major complaint. The corporation or camp must then make a decision on that recommendation within 10 days. It is important to note that no person, including the misconduct complaints officer, the misconduct committee, an investigator, a mediator, or a leader, should ever advise a complainant that procedure under this policy is a substitute for criminal, civil, or administrative proceedings outside the policy. When it comes to pastoral care, the misconduct committee must immediately ensure the availability of pastoral care and counseling to the complainant, respondent, and their families. Costs related to any counseling assistance provided will be the responsibility of the diocesan synod, corporation, or camp as applicable. No person who is witness or party in the proceeding of a major complaint may provide pastoral care or counseling. When appropriate, the bishop may direct additional pastoral care and counseling to the affected church community. Now we'll dig into the details of the investigation and reporting process. First, the misconduct committee completes a major complaint investigation and submits their investigation report to the misconduct complaints officer within 90 days of receipt. The misconduct committee may delegate to an investigator the task of completing a complaint investigation and preparing the draft investigation report. The report must include the written complaint with the date on which it allegedly arose, the names of the parties and persons interviewed, the respondent's response to the complainant, confirmed findings of fact, alleged but unconfirmed statements, deductions from the findings of fact, a factual conclusion if possible, recommendations, the author of the report, and the date of the report. Following receipt of the investigation report, the misconduct complaints officer will make a finding on whether the complaint is substantiated within 21 days. The misconduct complaints officer then gives written decision with reasons to the bishop, complainant, and respondent. If the misconduct complaints officer determines the complaint has been substantiated, he or she may impose a penalty on the respondent or refer the matter to the Minister of New Brunswick Social Development or a responsible policing authority. If the complaint is found to be false or malicious, discipline may be imposed on the complainant. Again, this is about protecting everyone involved. Either party may appeal the decision in writing to the bishop within 30 days. The bishop will make a decision on the appeal within 60 days. So what penalties can be imposed? Depending on the severity of the case, the misconduct complaints officer may impose an oral or written reprimand, suspension with or without terms, or a recommendation to the bishop that the cleric or layperson be dismissed from their position. During a suspension, if the respondent is in violation of the diocesan misconduct policy or safe church regulation, they will be required to complete full scope training. They may not participate in church activities until the safe church training is completed to a satisfactory level. The misconduct complaints officer will then issue an unappealable written decision on the eligibility of the guilty respondent for reinstatement within 60 days of receiving a request. Penalties the bishop can impose include revoking the license of a cleric found guilty of sexual assault of a child, youth, or vulnerable adult in a criminal proceeding, as well as dismissal or removal as a volunteer any layperson, employee, or volunteer found guilty of sexual assault of a child, youth, or vulnerable adult in a criminal proceeding. Upon request for a work-related reference check, the bishop must disclose any disciplinary action received under the misconduct policy, as well as a decision in any criminal, civil, or administrative proceeding in relation to a complaint. Just a few more areas to cover before we wrap up here. First of all, mediation. I mentioned earlier that parties to a complaint may engage in mediation at any time in the proceeding, with the noted exception of sexual abuse of a child, youth, or vulnerable adult. In mediation, the parties enter in good faith with intent to work towards a mutually acceptable settlement. Neither the misconduct complaints officer nor the parties involved will take further legal action during mediation. The mediation process must be completed within 60 days. If it fails, both parties resume investigation or decision-making process. The proceedings are governed by the mediation agreement form found online, and the mediator provides impartiality and assists parties to negotiate a voluntary settlement of the issues. The parties may obtain legal advice during the course of mediation at their own cost. Another recently revised area in the misconduct policy is in regards to confidentiality. The major change is that, except when required by law, all proceedings under the misconduct policy will be kept confidential. Similarly, all documents that form part of the proceeding will be confidential. The bishop may, after consultation with the misconduct complaints officer and the diocesan chancellor, require the proceedings to be made public or that the documents be disclosed to the public. Each corporation or camp must cooperate and share information related to the complaint with an external investigation authority. The misconduct complaints officer will make a report to the external authority upon written request. Also, the misconduct complaints officer is the sole media spokesperson in relation to matters under this policy. They also assist in preparation of all the media announcements. The names of the alleged complainants, respondents, other witnesses, and third parties will be confidential unless otherwise directed by the bishop. And now on to our final area, records management. The misconduct complaints officer will retain in a secure location all records for a minimum of 35 years, including but not limited to the following: summaries of minor complaint settlements, all major complaints, findings, recommendations, and reports of investigation and of the misconduct committee, information made available by the mediator to the misconduct complaints officer and misconduct committee, and all written decisions and other related communications by the misconduct complaints officer and the bishop. So that is the entirety of the Safe Church policy and regulation. As I mentioned throughout the presentation, it can feel overwhelming, but most of these policies are derived from good sense and just written down for reference, and they're here for the protection of everyone involved in any activity or participating within the church. You can visit the website and view or download any of the forms I mentioned, as well as browse through the regulation in its entirety or take the online training if you'd like. Everything is there for you to use as a reference, as it's not expected that everyone can recite the timeline details or adult-to-child ratios for every situation at all times. And obviously, even doing this presentation, I had my slides handy to reference and to read off of, as it's a lot of information and it's all available to reference at any time. For any questions not answered in this training or online, you can call me anytime at the Synod office. The phone number is 506-459-1801, and I will do my best to answer your questions and concerns. And I always appreciate feedback on this training or how the regulation is coming across and how it's being implemented, so please pass that along as well. And thank you so much for being here and for your dedication to the church.